Great, wonderful. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to work with you. Now, I thought I had prepared a handout, and I think we should also distribute this one because I think it's a good basis and reference point for everyone. So, what you can expect from me today is I will run you through a landscape of responsible leadership, which is a positive approach to leadership, which is values-based, which is looking into creating positive value. It is a stakeholder-based approach, and so quite a different step, but which allows, I think, for quite substantial reflection and for thinking about what does it mean for design. Having said that, I'm not a designer, so I'm a management and leadership scholar, right, and with a practitioner background in leadership development. So, in your book you have some of the objectives for today, and we are going to look into this kind of framework. And so this is the handout that you have in on your knees right now, and I will walk you through that and provide you with some examples. So when we talk about leadership and responsible leadership, we look into the positive side. So it's about learning from positive examples, but sometimes we also need to look into what are the dark cases as well to derive some learning from there. But what we see is that leaders today face new challenges, societal ones, environmental context. We all talk about climate change, the social context, diversity, integration, well-being, aging society, and of course also the geopolitical context, which keeps us all awake, right? Starting with hunger and poverty, but also the refugee crisis, but then also war and our longing for peace in the world. And the question is, what can be the contribution also of leaders in this context? Now, what we saw is that in the past, accidents, corporate wrongdoing, etc., brought the topic of responsible leadership onto the agenda. It started at the beginning of the millennium with what you see here, the EFMD call for responsible leadership. And then 12 years later, you see here Klaus Schwab, who initiated the founder of the World Economic Forum, and there they had their summit dedicated to responsive and responsible leadership. So quite a resonating topic in different areas. Now, you may ask, why is the topic of relevance? I gave some examples for that, but you're all educators. So if you're interested, here's also a video that you can use in order to find more information around that. So I won't have the time to get into everything today because it's quite a substantial and broad area. But within the 35 minutes that I'm going to give you some background on that, you will get a substantial insight, I would say. So here my colleagues Günther Steil and Marie Saleh-Dulic, they distinguish in terms of responsible leadership behavior and their impact around avoiding harm and doing good. So socially irresponsible leaders, they do not care, right? They externalize costs and they do not care about the consequences of business impact. This is different with responsible leaders. So they now care for different reasons, but refrain from activities that harm others and are looking into doing good. So we have this tension between avoiding harm and doing good, right? So an important one here. Now, what we also see, business leaders, but also leaders in the broader public, are expected to actually contribute to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which you can see here, 17 of them, ranging from no poverty to water and life on land, education, and partnerships among different constituents in order to resolve societal problems that are there. So, now the topic is leadership, And responsible leadership is a little bit different from the traditional leadership research, Pascal theories, etc. What we see in the traditional leadership research is that there is a leader who tries to influence followers to achieve results, right? Mainly business results, and it is focused on leadership effectiveness. Now, what is missing here? What do you think? Anything that comes to mind? The responsibility part. So that had been excluded for quite some time. So here we have this very dyadic relationship between leaders and followers. Now, in light of the broader challenges that leaders in business and public areas are facing, we see that the role of leadership has broadened. So leadership is nowadays about mobilizing different stakeholders. So what you can see here are different stakeholder groups. So that's the stakeholder model. Edward Freeman is one of the founders here. And the stakeholder is, for instance, the employees, classical one, right, of a leader. But then we also have clients, customers. We have the suppliers. We have financiers, so classical shareholders. We also have the communities in which organizations act and where leaders need to take care that the organization has a license to operate. We have civil society that nowadays looks very, very carefully about what leaders are doing. Think about the media. And we have the planet, where leaders have to make choices about their decisions and how they impact these different stakeholders in order to achieve results. But they also, if you look back into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, many of the problems today cannot be resolved by one party, by one leader, by one organization, but it needs collaboration among different constituents in order to create social and public value. So leaders therefore mobilize different stakeholders to work together with them in order to create results. And these results are not restricted to making profit, but also to creating value for society. We have also here the consideration for doing no harm and doing good, right? We have the triple bottom line. So the triple bottom line is an important sustainability concept. So in the sense of people, planet, profit. So not only delivering on the economic bottom line, but also create value for society and reduce the environmental footprint. And it is also about creating change for the better. And only then, when leaders are good and mobilize people, get them together to create results, and do that in a convincing way, something like trust can emerge, right? So it is a complex process there, which goes beyond the simple diet. So one can actually define responsible leaders. So they build and cultivate sustainable relationships with different constituents or stakeholders to achieve mutually shared objectives based on a vision of business as a force for good. So that's the desirable objective, right? That's what one would like to see. Now, what we see here is that obviously through this new approach and through the expectation in broader society, the scope of responsibilities of leaders is broadening immensely. So in the past, hardly any of the business leader has been developed and trained in order to be able to interact with these different constituents, to have the consequences of actions in mind, not only for business, but for society as well, right? Therefore, the education side is important, and not only in one discipline, but across disciplines. And I think the design area plays an important role here. Sorry. Okay. Now, this is simply to highlight the research on responsible leadership is huge. There are different areas. So it is looking into the interpersonal processes, what makes a responsible leader. I won't go into that today. It looks into the dynamic processes between leaders and stakeholders in order to create value. So that's what I'm looking into. And the multi-level processes through which responsible leaders co-create sustainable organizations. This is also a different module. So I will look more into this dynamic aspect. Now, responsible leadership is interesting. Like sustainability, it's not the same concept in the minds of all. So there are different interpretations. People make sense in different ways of this particular phenomenon. Therefore, we were quite interested in order to learn more about what is the reality out there? What are the different logics? What are the narratives that are told around responsible leadership, to better understand also how leaders approach societal issues. So we did a study with 25 senior executives from different industries, from different countries, as you can see here, representing Asia, Europe, and the US, and from different sectors. I won't go into detail, but our analysis showed that responsible leadership is actually not only a concept, but a landscape of different understandings of what it means to be responsible and to lead responsible in a complex stakeholder environment. So what you see here is the space in which actually the concept falls. And you see here the breadth of stakeholder focus. This means it can be either narrow, so focus on, for instance, a single stakeholder. This may be a client, it may be an employee, it may be the shareholder. And we have a broad range, meaning some leaders consider a broad range of stakeholders and consider them when making choices, when making decisions. And on the y-axis, you see that there are different degrees of responsibility. So some have a very low degree of responsibility, rather driven by self-interest, and others have a very high degree, are very socially oriented. Now, within the space that these two axes create, we were able to identify 4 different prototypes. And that's the idealist, the traditionalist, the instrumentalist or opportunity seeker, and then the integrator at the right top left corner. So I will walk you through this, right, step by step, and provide you with some examples, where possible, make some links to design. Having said, I'm not an expert on that. Now, if you are interested in more literature on that, it's on the resource paper. You will see here an article that details this approach in more detail. But I will walk you through that and try to be quite condensed and quick, right, to the extent possible. So if we look at the idealists with whom I like to start, you see they have a very narrow stakeholder focus. They have a high degree of responsibility. If you look into what drives them, then they want to change the world for the better. They are idealists. They really want to create change. They want to help others, particularly people in need, and do that via a business approach. So in this sense, from an ethics point of view, you have an altruistic ethics here. The belief system is also embedded in a social welfare logic. For them, people are important, and the purpose why they are doing business is to help others. Therefore, the leadership style, if you look into that, is a servant one. So one tries to serve the interests and needs of others. Their performance focus is not economic. So usually what we find here are non-profit organizations, social enterprises. So they try to get their funding through donor money. And the performance focus as such is environmental, social, or humanitarian. So for them, business activities are a means to create social and public value. I have an example here. So this is Gram Vikas. You see here the picture of Dr. Joe Madiat, founder and a long-time CEO and chairman. one of the selected social entrepreneurs of the Schwab Foundation of the World Economic Forum. He actually set up a quite interesting social enterprise. So they are consulting basically communities and help them to set up their own water and sanitation system. For him, it is about bringing dignity to people. They only engage if a community decides and agrees to 100% inclusion. So in India, you have the caste system. Often the people at the bottom of the pyramid are excluded, but only they engage and help these communities if they agree that everybody is included. As you can see here, for them, water is the point of entrance to help people. They bring water and sanitation system to these communities, help them to build them. As you can see here, women and girls are often the water holders of the nation. They spend hours to get water, often water that is contaminated, leading to maladies and illnesses. So when they come with their approach and help, it will look like that. They help them to build these water and sanitation systems. India is a country where you have open defecation. So for them, having a very simple bathroom is quite a substantial innovation, right? So this is an example for advancing human dignity and using design and architecture in order to achieve that. Here you have an example how they build some of the water towers to get the water to the communities. Now, another interesting aspect here is if we look into innovation. Innovation is an important step in order to achieve, create societal value. So what they do is not, what you see here is a first order solution. A first order solution and innovation is if you if you simply have a remedy for a problem, right? Like here you see the sachet pure, which can be used in order to transform polluted water into clean drinking water. Now, what Gramvikas does is they bring a real second-order solution to the communities by helping them to get access to clean drinking water. The result of that was a drop in maternity deaths, in child mortality, etc. So, having said that, when we look into this graph here, you see that was created by Everett Rogers. So that is a graph on the diffusion of innovation, ranging from innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority to laggards. Now, if we position here the idealists, what we often see, they are here innovators. They take substantial risk to set up their business, to introduce new innovations into market, often in areas where the public system fails or where it's not attractive for multinational companies to get engaged. And they go so far that they are often also self-sacrificing. So they would even run this if they incur a loss. And this is what we often see with many startups, obviously. So if one looks and assesses this approach, what we see is the idealist has an enormous enthusiasm and drive for social purpose. Unfortunately, what they often lack are the management skills in order to scale their business. The challenge is therefore to survive the startup phase, to achieve financial sustainability. One can collaborate with angel investors, and then broadening the social impact and scaling up. So this is quite an interesting movement, the whole idealistic areas with social entrepreneurs as change agents. And it is a movement that has started at the beginning of the millennium, and where institutions like Ashoka and the Schwab Foundation were important in order to provide a network for those leaders to engage. Now, I will now move into a very different quadrant. It is the polar opposite to that, right? So this is the traditionalist. So they have a narrow focus. They are not focused like the idealist on people in need, but on satisfying the owners and the shareholders. They usually have a low degree of accountability, but they are still in this area of positivity, of responsible leadership, right? Because while they are not driven by humanistic values, but usually by an economic purpose, by a profit motive, even aspects like their own self-interest, their own salary, their own ambitions, they try to create and sell goods and services to generate a financial surplus for the owners. Performance focus, the economic bottom line, leadership style, as we saw it, mostly autocratic. Do you know who this is? This gentleman here? Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winner, right? Introduced, more the neoliberal aspects into business, very much efficiency driven, has basically shaped the past, I would say, 50 years. We saw now a move away from this strict shareholder value model. So for them, if one looks into social value creation, here the motto was the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, right? Leaders are seen as agents of shareholders and should concentrate and focus on profit maximization, which many CEOs still do and have to do. Social stakeholders are not necessarily on the radar, so it's rather a distant approach. Yet, you may ask, why are they sitting here in this responsibility area? Well, if a traditional economist does his or her job, they at least have a minimal social societal responsibility. They create jobs, they pay taxes, they obey the law, and try to reduce harm, right? So what we see, reducing environmental footprint, CO2 emission, trying to save water, etc. Now, traditionally, they only engage in corporate social responsibility, and by the doctrine are only allowed to do that if it's legally required, helps save costs, minimizes risks, and has a direct positive effect on the economic bottom line. Now, if we make the link to sustainability, obviously this is there, because we all know today that we can save costs by saving water, electricity, etc. Right? So, they do not actively promote social innovation or contributing to developing solutions to societal problems. Sorry, here something happened. I'm not sure what. It's a bit different, but okay. So what we saw that for the most part is they sit in this area here, more the late majority or laggards when it comes to considering sustainability issues, corporate social responsibility issues. An example to look into financial services firms. Microfinance was developed by social entrepreneurs, but nowadays you also find that in a portfolio of a decently responsible bank, for instance, that put it into their portfolio. Right, so we have it sitting here, and when there is no risk, one engages in that. Okay, so we saw that there is a move away from the pure traditionalist to the instrumentalist. You may have seen in the media that today, particularly in the US, the Business Roundtable had shifted their purpose from a pure shareholder orientation to a stakeholder orientation. And with it, many of the large FT 500 companies and their leaders have agreed that this is a good idea and that one should do it because it's important. Broader public customers want that. So we see this broadening of the stakeholder perspective here, but still very much in line with the ideas of the traditionalists. So it's an evolution what we are seeing here, right? Still driven by a self-interest, shareholder value maximization. But here we see now the accountability is broadening from shareholders to key business stakeholders, like employees, like clients. And we see here a rather transactional leadership style, not so much autocratic, but transactional. And the underlying ethics, and I already make an allude to your contribution later, is utilitarianism. So the interesting part here, I mean, the instrumentalist has very much driven by strategic thinking, marketing thinking, scanning the environment for risk and opportunities. And since more and more of the stakeholders today are actually expecting leaders in their businesses to engage in sustainability, they are responding to that. And therefore, we see this kind of steady increase of corporate responsibility reporting or sustainability reporting. Right? So still here, the primary focus is the economic bottom line, but I call it profit plus, because one tries to also create some social value, particularly in those areas where one can benefit. Yes?
What is the difference really between the traditionalist and the instrumentalist?
They have the broader scope of stakeholders in their view. They are more responsive, not reactive, and they try to actually engage actively in societal and sustainability issues because they know the business can profit from it. So there is a market there. So they see that, and therefore companies engage in that and also report on that. Here is the latest KPMG trend, where you can see that 96% of the largest 250 companies in the world are actually reporting on sustainability. An interesting aspect here, if you look here, that's Jeff Immelt, former CEO of General Electric. He was quite early also, so they are usually in the early or also late majority of innovators. He brought to the market this eco-imagination campaign, and so meaning they implemented renewable energies already quite early. That was, for instance, in 2005, and developed it into a profitable business line. But when asked why he is doing that, and he told that in one of his shareholder speeches, he said, "We are investing in environmentally cleaner technology because we believe it will increase our revenue, our value, and our profits, not because it's trendy or moral, but because it will accelerate our growth and make us more competitive," right? So here we have the business case that is driving sustainability, that is driving corporate social responsibility, that is driving social value creation. And we have other examples of CEOs that have transformed their organization, and they can make quite a huge impact where they put, when they put their focus on this area. Now, yet, they only engage in sustainability as long as it pays, as long as they can really leverage that. So the conditions of engagements are, they need to have an alignment with the business strategy, right? It needs to add to the business portfolio, needs to provide new business opportunities, and supports the strategic positioning. So this is very strategic here, right? And once they make a positive decision, right, then they also invest substantially. Here is one of the key authors in this field from the strategy. It's Michael Porter, created this shared value approach. So here again, why they are doing it, if it's generating win-win approaches. Right? But what we see is often this tendency one does what one knows quite well. So innovation in this area is usually integrated into existing strategies, into existing processes. Therefore, one rather sees incremental innovations, incremental solutions. So think about the catalytic converter. right? That's not really, has not really resolved our problem of mobility. It had only extended the use of the traditional automotor. Before then, the electric vehicle actually entered our markets. So what we see is we usually would say that the majority of leaders in this area are sitting here between the early and late majority of innovations. So the positive side is when they really look into sustainability, for instance, they can have a broad impact with it, a positive broad impact in terms of reducing emissions, in terms of introducing, for instance, better materials, like for instance cotton in t-shirts, etc. But still the challenge is that it usually remains in this remedy stage. And if one focuses too much on first order solutions, what we know from Paul Watzlawick, which you may know, is that this can become a problem in itself because it hinders new radical innovations that may help to resolve existing problems. So that was the third one. Now, the fourth mindset, so the fourth logic behind responsible leadership is the integrative approach. What we see here is a combination between a broad stakeholder focus and a high degree of accountability towards others. So, integrators are really driven by, like the idealist, humanitarian values. They want to create substantial change. They want to contribute to alleviating existing challenges like poverty, like the environmental crisis. And their belief system is rather guided by ethics. So doing the right thing is the right thing to do. They are looking into substantial ethics, deontological ethics, Kantian approach, follow the golden rule. They look into particular virtues that they like to bring into the business world, like true values like honesty, fairness, integrity. And they have an integrative logic. So they want to bring together business, societal impact, and reduction of the environmental footprint with a focus not on actually looking into cost-benefit analysis, but pursuing a social welfare logic, but combine that with the business case. They combine ethical reflection with business consideration. They look into cooperation and care, but also know they are in a competitive market. They try to be a business and society. So sometimes it's quite paradoxical what we see here, because it's like the Quadratur des Kreises. But there are examples of organizations that achieve that. Right? If you look into the whole B Corp movement, there are quite a number of organizations. Think about Patagonia, think about Timberland, Denon or Danone. I brought here an example from South Australia, so it's Julique. So Julique is one of the leading luxury brands in cosmetics. They're not so well represented in Europe, but in the US and Asia. And this is Ulrike Klein. So she also has a German background. Ulrike and Jürgen Klein moved to or immigrated to Australia to set up their dream to build a biodynamic company. So many of the ingredients for their creams, for their cosmetics, come from their farm. And the farm is in South Australia in the Adelaide Hills. It was basically never touched. So there was unpolluted ground, which one needs in order to produce in a biodynamic way. But still, they are a for-profit organization. So for them, it was a dream to create, grow, and manufacture healing skincare products, right? And they try to have principles where they work in harmony with nature. And I have a little video here that I like to show you.
Powered by the raw purity of nature. The soil is alive, nourishing our farm. It's the foundation of our living world. Plants and herbs flourish and grow. We cultivate a sustainable life energy because we replenish and respect the living world around us. It's an eternal commitment, the biodynamic way. Our hand-picked botanicals yield a unique and complex character. From earth to extraction, our process is holistic, honest and pure.
Okay, so this gives you a little bit of an idea. So you can see it's a quite different approach. It's a very different language that they are speaking. It's also, I think, a quite different design approach that they have translated into the video itself. So it's really this aspect of balancing and optimizing different objectives that are there. We see similar approaches, perhaps not in this kind of design-focused way. If you look into Novo Nordisk, for instance, that's a pharmaceutical company, world market leader in the production of insulin. They also have this kind of triple bottom line approach, where they try to balance different aspects. So we see here, as well as with Jolik, the customer is in the center. Right? It's not the shareholders and other ones, it's the customer. So the relationship focus is engaging with and caring for the needs of different stakeholders. It is really taking that into consideration when making decisions. And so thinking from those stakeholders that one wants to engage with and to see what the company can actually achieve and how this can also guide decision making. I give you another example, again from another industry. This is here Paul Polman. Some of you may know him. He was former CEO of Unilever. So when he started, he changed the way of how fast-moving consumer goods companies may approach their particular projects. And what he said, when we look into profit making, he started with a different understanding of the purpose of a business. So he said, I don't think our fiduciary duty is to put shareholders first. I say the opposite. What we firmly believe is that if we focus our company on improving the lives of the world's citizens and come up with genuine and sustainable solutions, we are more in sync with consumers and society, and ultimately, this will result in good shareholder returns. That's a little bit of a different approach. We have other examples. Ray Anderson, I may come to him later, former CEO, founder of Interface, carpet manufacturing company. And he said, for those who think business only exists to make a profit, I suggest to think again. Business makes a profit to exist. Surely it must exist for some higher purpose. Right? So we have here different approaches, and they proactively engage in sustainability and CSR. And for them, it's important to make a substantial contribution to public value creation. So their engagement in innovation is quite substantial. So it's not incremental, but often we have really true second-order solutions. Like, for instance, if you look into the Body Shop and the founder, Anita Roddick, what she did was very early on, she didn't talk about it, but she introduced fair trade. It was already at the beginning of the 80s when she engaged with indigenous communities and sourced from them the ingredients that they needed for some of their cosmetics, and at the same time paid them a fair price. So quite different from what the cosmetics industry at that time was doing. So what responsible leaders are doing is they have a values-based approach, right here, and they have very strong individual values, right? So that's something that's at their core. So it's about humanity, courage, integrity. It's about interpersonal values like tolerance, recognition, respect for others, fairness, right? We see here quite a number of so-called virtues. I won't have the time to go into detail, but here is a source as well, where you can find further information on that. So therefore, yeah, let me just come back to that. One of the key questions also that you can ask yourself, or your students can ask themselves, what are my key values? What is my moral compass? An important aspect and underlying assumption behind these different understandings also of responsible leadership. Then also when we look into leadership styles, I only briefly touched on the idealist has a servant style, the traditionalist often has an autocratic one, the opportunity seeker or instrumentalist often transactional, but here we really have different roles that leaders try to live, that we can observe. They are servants, they are citizens, they are stewards of the environment in which they operate. They try to be positive change agents, right? They are storyteller. Communication is an important aspect of bringing across the purpose, aligning and mobilizing others in order to achieve objectives together. So, they actually engage in creating societal value, not only when it is creating win-win, but when they really can make a substantial contribution, like a second-order solution. For them, it's really about creating positive change in the environment in which they operate. So what we see, therefore, often is they are sitting in this early adopter spectrum, being visionaries, really having this view and direction of where they want to go, where they want to mobilize others to go with them, where they can co-create new futures. So important aspect, particularly if we look into how do we want to leave the planet for future generations, right? We need to have these visionaries who think about the impact of their decisions and create second-order social innovation in order to be able, that we all are able to live on our planet, and our children and grandchildren can do the same. But the challenge for them is they have to handle multiple priorities at the same time. And this is quite difficult in a market environment. So for CEOs and senior leaders and founders of organizations, it's important to have this broader educational spectrum and knowing about the risk and opportunities of these different approaches. But we have quite good role models, be it Unilever, the CEO of Whole Foods Market, also the late Anita Roddick with the Body Shop. So this is basically the framework, and that's what is on your handout as well. So where we see these different approaches, where we can ask where and how can each mindset make the best contribution to social change for the better, right? So I think these different approaches all have a certain contribution to make. But the question is also, I think, for designers, where do you see your students going? Where do you see that? Is there a particular quadrant where you think education should focus on more or less? Or where we would have perhaps different focus, right? So let me see, I do have this in an overview. And And I would now like to open the floor for some Q&A. I'm sure there are a lot of questions.
I find the terms interesting, idealist, traditionalist. How did you come up with that? And is it the result of the interviews you did with the CEOs? Because it sounds like the integrator, from my perspective, it would be more the responsible entrepreneur, if you look into responsible innovation. And the traditionalist and instrumentalist, they just sound like they don't really look into responsibility. And the instrumentalist is more smarter than the other one. And the idealist, I think it's too black and white. But I don't know if I am sure you had these critics already, or how your stand is on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So first of all, yes, it's very black and white. That was the idea. It's static. One can have a dynamic view on that too, to see how certain leaders and their organizations move between the quadrants. That's what we are also seeing. So organizational development, leadership development, that plays a role. Your question was, how did I come up with the names? Well, when looking into and analyzing the different speeches and interviews, it was quite clear, also by the quotes, that some of them had an underlying, let's say, management or economic background. And so if you look into the traditionalists, so in the beginning, it was called economist, but economists, I mean, I do not want to alienate the discipline, and this has moved forward. So Milton Friedman is only one particular person who influenced business and business leaders quite substantially. I call it now traditionalist because we see so much innovation going on, and this is rather what was very much forming the past 50 years in business. The opportunity seeker instrumentalist, it's the opportunity seeker marketing or strategy is very much looking into risk and opportunities. So this is the strategic approach behind it. You can also name it strategist. But then, I mean, the integrator has also strategic competencies there. So I rather there looked into the instrumentalist side, which is more linked than to the utilitarian underlying ethics. The idealist, well, that's where we find a lot of social entrepreneurs. That's not the norm. It has something that has developed over time. So it's a particular group of people who want to change the world. We also have, and that's quite interesting, there are people who sit in this quadrant, very much in line with Milton Friedman, but still setting up their own foundations in that way, trying to keep that separate. But the integrator is really bringing it together. So therefore, the name, kind of the idealistic, humanistic side, but then still knowing that the economic bottom line counts and what needs strategic and instrumental thinking as well. But one needs to have a different way of decision making. Hope that answers your question.
Nicola, one question. Have you researched about how the management leadership changes with people going through the ranks or climbing up? Like you start with small responsibility as a traditionalist, go to instrumentalist, and then in the top executive level, you end up as an integrator. Because in the beginning, you have little chance to be an integrator sometimes.
Yeah, that's so true. I haven't studied it as such, but I mean, from sociology, I mean, it's clear if someone, let's say, comes into an organization as an idealist and is in a very traditional context, obviously often they have to leave their values or their ideals at home. That's what often happened in the past. But what we see is that we have now a broader variety of organizations that allow now also students to choose where to go, into which organization they go. They can analyze. You can use, for instance, this framework. I sometimes do that with my executive students to think about when they want to make their next career move. What are their core values? Right? We had this. I showed this value frame before. What are their core values, and then think about and what is their preferred responsible leadership approach, and then to look into a context where they would have a good fit, right? Where they can really flourish with what is important for them, what their qualities are. So this is one use of this framework, actually. I also,
Thank you very much for this fantastic lecture. You shed some light on businesses. How about all the other institutions? For instance, the institution I'm working for, which is a university run by a state or a country or a community. We know hospitals. We have other institutions. How about them?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It also works for them. So you just mentioned the medical area, hospitals and medicine. Coming from Australia, what we have seen over the past decades is that there was this kind of new public management approach and making hospitals more efficient, and really the profit aspect was very dominant. And this creates a lot of challenge for people working in that area, for nurses, for doctors, often where this kind of their personal values were lost, where they need to reconnect and where they see the limits of this kind of traditional approach, where they see that with a more integrative approach, they can actually better achieve their goals, which is service to the patients. But this requires, obviously, a lot of reflective practice. It requires self-reflection. It requires discourse within teams, with top management and leadership, in order to further develop the organization to a different, let's say, culture. But that is what leaders actually can achieve. If they see there is a particular direction in which we should be going, they are the ones that can help shape culture, help enable co-creation processes. But it requires a different leadership style, one that is inclusive, one that is actually considering the interests and needs of others. And this is not happening from today to tomorrow. It's a longer-term change process. But what I always say, it's good to start with educating students, because they will be the future leaders who can actually create change if they can actually, if they have this drive to basically initiate change within their organization, and when they have a very strong moral compass and value space.
Thanks a lot for this wonderful morning session. Allow me to ask one question. Have you considered or researched any change within the last, let's say, 3-5 years? Because when the climatic change was getting more and more obvious, when we had 2 wars on our planet, so I can imagine that has an impact, maybe not on the definition of the roles, but maybe on a second level of behavior inside a role.
Yeah, important part. I mean, yes, change in different contexts. So if we look into, for instance, the curricula of business schools. So in the past, I mean, it was a very traditional leadership approach that was taught. What we see now is that inclusive leadership plays an important role, servant leadership. This has an effect. That is the individual level. If we look at the more organizational level and movements, what we see is that there is the whole B Corp movement, there are so many organizations that sit into this quadrant. Do you know what B Corps are? So they're for benefit corporations that actually get certified by very, very thorough standards on environmental and social aspects, and then can call themselves a B Corp. For instance, Danone, so the yogurt manufacturer, the CEO there was very, very let's say, dedicated to actually changing the organization already at the beginning of the millennium. So they changed their purpose from being a yogurt company to becoming a health provider. So really having nutritious food. And so what they did, and that's a very strategic decision, to sell some of their quite lucrative business units, like, for instance, beer and cookies. So because this is obviously not good from a nutritional point of view, and focused instead of their yogurt manufacturing and baby nutrition and also dietary assortments. So they have a huge different product lines which they had established. And for them it was more important to actually look into the social purpose, right? But still being a profitable company. Yet, having said that, the CEO, the recent one, Emanuel Faber, was quite successful in the triple bottom line approach. But it was that a minority of shareholders pushed him out of his position, because they said they are not bringing so much return for them as does, for instance, Unilever or Nestlé for their shareholders. So this is the downside. Therefore, the integrative approach is a quite, let's say, demanding one, where one really needs to know what are the positions of the different stakeholders there. But more companies try to get into this domain. Nestlé, for instance, they have the Nespresso brand, right, which was certified by, as well, by B Corp. So they have this approach that they have certain brands that they try to get into this quadrant. While, for instance, in contrast, Unilever, Australia and New Zealand, Nikki Sparshot, female CEO, got the whole Unilever branch or subsidiary certified as B Corp as well. So these are the trends that we are seeing. More and more organizations that want to go into this quadrant. Yet we also have quite a number of organizations that simply like to use the language, right? And where we have this whole discussion around greenwashing, and where it's so important for customers, for scientists, but also for investors to actually have a quite sophisticated approach to assess where do organizations stand? What is the approach of the leader? Are they really walking the talk, or is it rather window dressing, right? Important discussion as well.
You were asking where we see our students, or I mostly saw this as a hiring perspective over the last 5 to 10 years. And I would say I've seen lots of designers wanting to be integrators, acting as idealists, and then when they came into their 30s and thought about retirement planning and family planning, actually taking a job in tech, which was traditionalist or maybe instrumentalist, because they wanted a 6-figure salary, right? And what I'm curious about is what are the skills and competencies that are needed to be able to essentially break that cycle? Because you were mentioning being an integrator means holding a lot of complexity. So what is it that we might need to act in that quadrant and to be leaders in that space? That sounds really aspirational.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a quite a complex set of competencies that is needed. So first of all, I mean, it's really about being aware of the own values, the own principles, being aware of the purpose. Why is one leading the enterprise? Why is one leading people? So it's the kind of self-awareness. Then the second competence is around interpersonal aspects, so being able to interact with different stakeholders, with different backgrounds, being inclusive, being able to facilitate processes where people with different backgrounds can come together, share their different opinions, be tolerant, right? And trying to facilitate this co-creation process. Then being a good communicator in the sense of being able to to mobilize others through the vision that one has, to be able to actually get them on board, creating win-win situations where people feel, oh, we are on a successful project together and can really contribute. So making use of the competencies of others. So it's kind of this personal, interpersonal competencies that are important to develop. And I know you had already the emotional intelligence side. It is also about moral courage. It is about resilience. So we had, I think, also contributions already here. So it's a whole set. And then also being able to set priorities, right? I mean, one has to juggle different bottom lines, but at certain points, one needs to be able to set priorities. And one needs to actually make responsible decisions. And so this would basically bring me, let me just check the time. This would bring me to one of the cases that I like to discuss with you as well. So I will show you a little video, and this is basically a dark case. So this is a case that sits outside the responsible leadership landscape here. But it is also, it is a case from the 70s, from Ford. I'm not sure if you know Ford Pinto. But let me just get there. Okay, yeah, different purposes, a shift there. Perhaps we don't have so much time. I'm just wondering, half an hour. I will take 5 minutes to go through this as well, because it's quite interesting. This is about shifting from one area to another, because there was this question if people can also make this move. And this is also a case where the person sat outside of the landscape, a dark case, in the sense that he was the founder of Identifies. So they produced, or still produce, carpet. So it's commercial floor coverage. And when doing that, a lot of emissions occur and a lot of toxic waste. And so they had, here you see, severe toxic impact. And he wanted to change to zero emission. So that was at the end of the millennium. And it was in the 90s already when a book landed on his, because he was asked to give a presentation on sustainability. And he was quite naive at that time, and he agreed to do that. And then he didn't know what to say, so he looked into the literature, and a book landed on his table by Hawking, The Ecology of Commerce. And it dawned on him that what he is doing was actually plundering the earth. And he said then often, today, they would put people like me into prison. And then he thought about, what is the legacy that I want to leave behind for my children and grandchildren? So he set about to create this huge change in his own company. And what they did was to create a sustainability pathway, starting with eliminating waste and emissions, renewable energy, and then went into basically circular economy. And it was, they compared it to climbing Mount Everest. Oh, no, sorry, I won't show that. You know what, I will show that because it's so interesting. It's about biomimicry a principle that they use for their design.
I have a couple of favorite examples of biomimicry at interface. One was entropy, random design. And that came about because David Oakey had the biomimicry company come in and do a workshop. And so the designers went out into the field and said, you know, how would nature make a carpet? And one of the things that we noticed when looking on a floor of leaves, that if you take one leaf away and you look down, you don't really notice the difference. There's a random order, but there's a definite color palette, you know, that works together. And it took David Oakey's brilliance then to turn that into what if every carpet tile was different, but in the same palette. We also did a workshop which led to tactiles. And that was this idea that, you know, how does nature adhere? Well, we looked at, you know, geckos, flies.
Let me just come in here. So what they did was they had commercial floor covering, and when you use that for a room, you have a lot of waste. So they came up with the idea to have floor tiles. So what you see here, and they had this idea from nature. So they looked at geckos and how geckos climbed the wall. And so they saw that they stick to the wall with only their 4 or 5 feet. And then they used only adhesives at one of these edges and trigger points. Therefore, were able to actually reduce the amount of emissions considerably. Right? And so then they used only recycled material. So circular economy was for them something that they introduced. They had a production line from cradle to grave, where they were very much in line with natural principles. And so he got actually people and employees engaged because they were fascinated by now working for a company that was not polluting the environment, but actually trying to change what the industry is doing. And they were quite successful in doing that. And so by 2020, they achieved this goal of zero emission by 2020. And what he did was he really got support by different stakeholders that were very responsive to their needs in order to have new design processes, new ingredients, new products. And he mobilized people to implement the change and to also keep on track in turbulent times. So he was always communicating with them, was available, was very much serving the needs of the whole crew of people that were there. So he was accessible, and he led by values and vision. So this is an interesting example. He moved from being outside of the responsible leadership landscape into becoming an integrator. But now I will share with you another example, and that is the case of Ford Pinto. So really where a CEO had to make a decision when being faced with the problem that I will show you in this video. So that was the situation. So the test of the Ford Pinto at that time showed that already below the 20 miles speed, when there is an accident, the car would crash and would explode because it was equipped with a gas tank in the rear of the car, right? So they had looked into that. They actually found a design solution for that. So they were able to redesign the car and the gas tank for a relatively low price. So they had estimated they would sell 12.5 million cars, And then to install or redesign the car would cost $12 US. And that would be approximately $75 today. Now, quite interesting, what did they do? So they were actually calculating the price. So they predicted the cost per car and also predicted the damage per people, right? So when introducing the car, this would result in death by burning of 180 buyers, serious burn injuries for another 180 buyers, 2,100 vehicles burned without repair. Then they monitorized this damage based on data from insurance companies. So they put a price tag on human life and came up with a calculation. So if they would introduce the car without the redesign, this was cost $49 million. Then, in comparison, it would cost 137 million worth of suffering for Pinto drivers if the car is redesigned. So the redesign would cost 137. So then they compared these costs, and so the CEO at that time, Lee Iacocca, thought he should bring the Pinto to the market. Now, not surprisingly, here is the forecast. People died, got seriously burned. They never calculated the number of burned vehicles, but that was over a decade, but shortly thereafter the Pinto was phased out. What remained for Ford for many decades was the reputation damage, and obviously for the families that lost their loved ones, the suffering, right? So what we see here was a neglect of the utilitarian no-harm principle, right? Now what I'd like you to do is to think about how would this situation be approached by a responsible leader? And what would that mean for the design education? Now, we still have some time. I'd like you perhaps to go into the groups and to discuss for 10 minutes what actually is the, what do you take away from the responsible leadership landscape? And how do you think would a responsible leader approach such a situation? What would you expect? What would you like your students to do? What could be their role? It's quite an open question, I know, but it's a starting point for discussion. So who would like to start?
Hello. Okay. So we had a very lively discussion, of, let's say, about like all the 4 quadrants of the chart that we've seen. Is there like a sort of complexity in organizations that link to maybe a certain type of leadership? And that we also kind of identified that a lot of leaders have a lot of like different qualities from different parts of the leadership styles, let's say. And I think a hands-on approach for students for like education would be to go into role play and in different kind of settings and actually maybe play the situations they would maybe encounter in their like future in an organization.
Thank you. Yeah, we spoke about a lot of different things, starting by this shouldn't be legal to make decisions like that, and what are the systems that actually hold these leaders accountable to not make these decisions. We also spoke about one term that really stuck with us was moral bankruptcy, which happens almost before the real bankruptcy that happens after those kind of decisions. We briefly talked about a study that actually shows what power does to human brains, and actually that with power there is less compassion and empathy, and that's sometimes the result of that power. And then last, we also spoke about a different way of looking at these quadrants on like what are the stakeholders that each of these 4 quadrants actually focus on mostly.
Do we actually need the mic? Okay, I'll give it a go. So what did we discuss? Really, what kind of voice would you need in this boardroom to change the conversation? And would a design-educated person be able to change this conversation that's usually only focused on the profit? Potentially by broadening the viewpoint, the time horizon, the creativity in which these kind of questions are discussed. Then there was this question, well, does the designer actually sit in the boardroom to have a voice at this table? And is it maybe a question that in the education of design, you would need to prepare students more to actually understand this business world, language, culture, making your points? And I hand over the mic to someone else who was in the group.
I thought you did a very good job. I think we took your problem challenge, Nicola, and changed it a little bit, as a lot of designers will do. But we also acknowledged that to do a kind of case analysis, it's helpful to use examples that are also current. And what about when design solutions are not known, but risk and uncertainty are high, which is something that I think we all understand very well we are facing. And that conversation led us to much of what you just brought to us, looking at what might be the responsible leadership approach with an advisory group around any board table that includes people who understand how to think through complex problems and perhaps to reframe how those problems are assessed, not in short terms or in long terms, but with different types of stakeholders. So we talked about how that might also lead us to thinking about design education. What sorts of strategies can we use a kind of business case analysis, case management reflection in design school? I mean, we do that anyway, but to do it more explicitly by looking at how business decisions might be made differently with design input, and conversely, how design education may be forced to face more difficult choices about design solutions when the parameters of businesses are encumbered. So there's some cross-pollination possibilities for us. Anyone else in the group would like to take the mic? Annette, are you reporting in?
I'm just taking good notes.
We'll all look at your notes afterwards. Oh, I think one other thing that came up was how we talk about principles. Are they just statements of proposition that are not encumbered in the business case that we heard about? Probably not there. Or are they actually assessed with performance monitoring metrics and so on? That's another way we might think about how to bring design discussions into governance.
Thank you. Thank you for this contribution, for this impulse from Nicola.